All right, welcome to Friends of Aquinas, the very first episode, premiere episode, and it is such an honor to have with me an esteemed American political commentator, Mr. Ramsey Paul, or Paul Ramsey, if you will. So, how are you today? Thank you very much for coming on. How's your day been? I heard you were meeting a very important guest, so why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, I just got back from lunch with Neilkumar. He's running for Congress here in Northwest Arkansas as a Republican. We
Arkansas.
have in the United States, the Democrats, Republican, and at first you have the primary to see who's going to win the Republican nomination and the Democrat nomination. In a lot of places in the United States, though, it's pretty well decided it's either going to be a Republican or Democrat. In the district I live in, it's definitely Republicans going to win. There's no doubt about that.
Hmm.
So it's just who's going to be the representative for the Republican Party. Currently, there's a guy named I think Steve Womack, I think his name is, and he's sort of a kind of the mainstream Republican that just talks about taxes. It's kind of owned by Walmart. He's that type of guy. And Neil Kumar is actually very right wing. He's very much for our people. And a lot of people they have troubles getting over the his name because obviously Kumar he's half Indian,
Hmm.
but he definitely holds our values, and he's a strong supporter of people on the right. A delightful young man, and I definitely will support his campaign. So he has an uphill battle because he's going against the establishment with all the establishment money. But I think if people heard his message, he would definitely have a chance to win the nomination here. So if he can win the nomination, he will be the congressman from Northwest Arkansas.
All right. Very interesting. Why don't we? Well, first of all, let's check in the chat if we can all, if they can all hear us very well. If they can, then we can just proceed. But in the meantime, I think the first thing that I'd like to talk about was your recent video on the generational divide, and I'd like to kind of take a look historically at this. Now, my theory is that the European people are prone more so than others to kind of abandon the ways of their fathers. I don't know if that makes any sense, to kind of
Yes.
revolt against their fathers more so than perhaps those in the East in Asia or in other places. I think an example. I think an example of that are our countless revolutions. I mean, that is a very stark example, but it is an example nonetheless. And of course, we have the modern kind of generational rivalry, kind of hatred going on. Not hatred, but that's a bit of a strong word. Sometimes it does get as strong, but not always. And also, you find that in other areas. I think in Asia, for example, even though they might not, for example, believe the traditional set of customs or the traditional religion of the place, they still respect it and they still like seeing it thrive in many cases. Whereas here in Europe, although we have a strong Christian heritage, and in America as well, we have a strong Christian heritage. What we find are people who instead seek to destroy and subvert this heritage. Why do you think that? Do you think that's accurate? And if so, why do you think that is?
Yeah, this is an interesting point, and it'd be interesting for the people listening to give their experience. And when I talk about this intergenerational thing, there's two components which I brought out in the video. There's one that's a little bit more superficial that I think is true for all nationalities when it comes to using tech. And it's funny you brought that up because right before we got online, I was joking about, "Oh, I could, I don't know if I have everything set up right here because of boomer tech." That's kind of a running joke, but that is true, I think, in almost all cultures now. Older people, because you're used to a certain way, and I think older people they're slower to adapt to something new. It is true, and I think that holds true. But then there's sort of a more of a deeper level. Is there sort of a deeper? You want to be different than the generation before you,
Mm,
and I'm not really sure if how long historically this has been the case. I know in the United States, from my understanding, there was a big change was when the 60s, the boomer generation, ironically, because they're the old people now, but at the time, They were the ones that came up with the term generation gap, and we're totally different. We have a new way of looking at things. Some of that I think might have been somewhat forced by other people. I don't know if that was true in definitely all cases, but other countries, for example, Tina Veek, a friend of mine, a co-host in that was my ex co-host of Happy Homeland. She lives in Finland. And I asked
Hmm.
her that question. They in Finland, she doesn't believe so much they have that generational differences, except for technology, of course. So I think it's more unique to the Anglosphere, like the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia. I'm guessing. I can only speak for the United States, but in the United States, it is definitely mostly the white heritage where you see that mostly, not so much that I've seen with like the African American or Black population. Of course, they have different styles. Like the Blacks used to wear those big afros in the 70s, and now they don't do that. But the way, I don't know if there's so much that intergenerational competition or tension that we have with our people. And and just reading history, I don't read much that it even happened much with our people. I read, for example, the Odyssey recently,
Hmm.
and I don't remember any generational differences there with the Greeks. Obviously, there's always some. Mostly, it has to do with sexual, where maybe in different families they don't want you to be with another woman because of a rivalry, but that's a different type of thing. So that's sort of my opinion on that. I don't know. What have you observed in Europe?
Well, I can tell you, for a fact, coming from Russian heritage, I can tell you that that is a really a stark, almost a defining feature I find of the Russians is this kind of constant revolt against the parents. I think it's a very prominent theme in Russian literature, for example. It's a very prominent theme, definitely in the history with all the patricides and regicides in terms of succession of I'm sure obviously that happened in Europe as well, but I think it's especially stark in Russian history. So I I do think that historically speaking, why I don't think it hasn't happened for the entirety of histories because simply speaking, I don't think people had the class mobility, or any other kind of mobility for that matter that we have started to possess with the advent, let's say, of the technological age. So for 1,000 plus years, even more than that, for thousands of years, I can say people have lived pretty much you were born on a farm and you die on that farm. You're born a blacksmith, and or you're born a son of a blacksmith and you'll die a blacksmith. That's just how it is. So I feel like sharing in sharing the profession of your father, you kind of you had a closer knit bond, a closer knit intergenerational bond. Whereas when the technological age has advanced and of course our the morals and the moral structures and societal structures um, have of course kind of in a sense, if you will, liberated us. Although I'm not sure if that is really liberation. Um, Now we started to kind of move up, and then there's almost an intergenerational competition that has started. I don't know if this is obviously not a concrete theory, but I don't know if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah, it could be almost like a class thing too. And I'm reading a book, A Goddess, a Trudge. Have you ever read Ulysses by James Joyce?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's he's a famous writer from Ireland. He wrote
Hmm.
this in the early part of the 20th century, and it's not an easy book. But he's one of those guys. He went to Oxford and he lived on the
Hmm.
continent. He wrote his kind of whiny books, in my opinion. But he was like, he had even back then, and this was supposed to take place in 1904. About, he didn't relate to the Catholicism and how oppressive it was and all that type of stuff. So there was sort of a rebellion at that point, even in his book. And I guess like his mother was a devout Catholic, she was dying, and she said, "Well, can't you say a prayer for me?" And like, "No, I can't do that because I'm an atheist." Blah blah blah. And I'm like, I wasn't impressed with him. I'm like, what an idiot, be some compassion. But a lot of those people, they got in their heads. But I don't think he ever did anything in his life except hang around Paris and Switzerland in the 20s, and that sort of set. But he was in the literary set. And so for like that crowd that had a lot of mobility, I think there was more of that. But I think you're
Hmm.
right. If you were born on a farm, you didn't have time to really think about how different that you are than your parents, because you had survival at stake and you just had to try to get through the day. So I think it's a little bit of a component too, is if you have a lot of free time on your hands, you can sit around and worry about these things. And as you said, if you have the technology where you can share your thoughts, and obviously, even in James Joyce's time, let's say in the 1920s, they didn't have the internet, but they still had wealthy people could still communicate. They had their papers, newspapers, and so forth, and they had a kind of a literary circle where they all kind of palled around each other. So I think that could be a component of that. Is you need a society where people have a lot of free time, and they're not just trying to live hand to mouth, where they actually have some wealth and they can worry about all this stuff. It kind of goes in the United States now. If you look on our Twitter, I'm not sure in Europe, but everyone is proud on their Twitter bios to list their mental illness. Everyone loves their
Hmm.
mental illnesses. And years ago, people don't have time for that nonsense. You just had to get through life, and everyone now announcing that I'm depressed. I'm struggling with depression now, and it's a disease. And years ago, I guess people got depressed, but get over it. You got to get the harvest in. If you don't, you die. That will cure your depression if you don't do that. So, I think it's sort of a product of our age. And as we talked in our roundtable, and by the way, thank you for inviting me to your first live stream. And you're going to be very successful. Thomas, if you guys don't know, he's part of my Patreon roundtable, and he's always like a favorite of everyone because you're very intelligent and you bring up good points. And one of the points you brought up, as I've read about too, is Calhoun's experiment with the mice and what happens when it becomes overpopulated and they have a lack of purpose. They tend to have all these other neurotic problems. And I think we have seen this in Western culture, that our own success has led to many of our issues that could lead to our downfall, sort of a circular pattern. And then out of the rubble, the strong people will come up again. But we're in a place now, we got a lot of people that in previous times would not survive very long. And unfortunately, we have all these weirdos and freaks that you see now in the public space on like Twitter, that years ago that they just want to be tolerated in a society.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I want to just catch on to a couple of points that you've made there. First of all, in this rebuilding after the rubble, I think that religiosity, for example, the reason why we live in such an irreligious time, I believe, is because there is an illusion of comfort. There is an illusion of that everything is going kind of fine. You've got food. You've got, as you said, you've got idle hands. So there is really nothing to fear, and as primitive as it sounds, but fear is a big part of religion. When you fear, you need some support, you need some moral authority, you need some spiritual authority, and that's why I believe in harder times. Well, scientifically speaking, in harder times, religiosity has played a bigger role, and I think we're in this late stages of the winter of civilization where just like in Rome, we have our bread and circus, but everything is falling around us. And any day now, we're going to realize that that is the case. And then the floodgates will open up, and it's going to be, I'm afraid to think of what it's going to be like. Because as you have said, all of these people who were gender studies professors and parasites on society and so on are going to, what are they going to do when you'll have to install a new light bulb? I mean, that's it. It's the end for them. Um, so, in that kind of spirit of discussing society and class system and so on, I wanted to move to talk specifically as we arise out of the ashes. What do you think would be a delicate balance between if between class mobility and having some sort of a hierarchy, or having an aristocracy and the lower classes, how do you think that should work out? Should we have a middle class even? Because I would argue even that a lot of the woes that we have suffered is due to this middle class that often has idle hands and so on and so forth. So there are plenty of systems to go through. You have the republic, then you have the feudalism, you have an empire. How do you see our society? How would you like to see our society structured?
Oh, that's an interesting question, and I got some radical ideas on that. I think I'm on the right, so I do believe in hierarchy. I'm not a fan of democracy. I think democracy always leads eventually to tyranny, like we're seeing. I think the Greeks understood that. And I am a believer of if I had to set it up, it'd be a constitutional monarchy, meaning you'd have a king, but the king wouldn't have unlimited power. He'd be checked by the Constitution. I would like to see aristocracy, but it's sort of a limited, maybe 3 generations. And I would have a limited democracy. I would set it up, I guess, like the old British system, maybe, where you'd have the House of Representatives, or I think they call it the Commons in Britain. Correct me if I'm wrong,
Hmm.
but that would be elected by um, from their districts. And if I set it up, it'd just be males over the age of 35, between the ages of 35 and 80, to be able to vote. I think people should be a little bit older before they can vote. And I think the males, it should just be for men that vote. And I think they should represent the household. And then for the Senate, or what I guess they would call the House of Lords, you'd have the aristocracy have representation, and then you'd have the king. Again, that would be checked by the Constitution. I think something like that would be probably one of the more stable systems. And also, then you had a constitution that dictated that the goal of the government is for the goodwill of the people, and everything should be looked into in that aspect of it. So it'd be definitely a lot. My views are obviously very radical compared to people like, what, you don't support democracy? Or Bernie Sanders is always saying that, oh, this isn't democratic. I'm like, well, thank God. I'm not a big fan of democracy because I see most people aren't very bright and they shouldn't be voting.
Mm.
It's odd that we think they should be voting. We want to have them do other things. We wouldn't want a democracy like who can do heart surgery on you. You want people that are qualified, but any moron we think should have as much a vote as someone that's quite intelligent and follows. So in a democracy, the problem is it's more of a rule by the rich because they can manipulate public opinion easy because they have the money and they can buy it. And most people, they're just swayed easily. They don't really think very critically. And so yeah, I'm not much of a fan of democracy, that's for sure. But at the same time, other systems I'm not a big fan of either. So I've kind of, in my mind, this is sort of my fantasy society. Uh, who knows if it ever happened? But you asked the question, so you got my fantasy.
No, 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 absolutely. I think it's important to theorize. I think it's important to learn the mistakes that we've made in history. I think it's important to praise the good times in our history and learn from that. And surely, as we await destruction, we need to think about what happens next. And there are so many ways. This is so fascinating. There are so many ways we can take this. Let me just make a quick point that it saddened me at the time in between 2016 and now that conservatism under the leadership of Trump, and not just national leadership, I mean, inspired by Trump in Europe, for example, we've seen these populist uprisings, and so it's calling themselves conservatives. Unfortunately for them, I have to totally agree with you that democracy is ruled by the mob, and the mob can be ruled by the rich. That is democracy for you in a nutshell. And so seeing these so-called conservatives popping up and just playing to the crowd and trying to kind of do the old, if you elect me I'll give you this, if you elect me I'll give you that, and kind of trying to incite the mob. I really think that's not the way we should go. But also I'd like to ask you, ask your opinion on this, but also I'd like to ask you, where do you see within that structure of a society, within that governmental structure, do you see a role for the church in the structure at all, either in governmental or societal? Um, and do you think it has any kind of role to play moving forward?
Yeah, and if in my fantasy society, I would have an official religion as Christianity, but that doesn't mean everyone has to be a Christian, but it would be Hungary already is this way, and it's already somewhat protected them. There was a push to have them take a lot of Islamic or Muslim refugees. And I remember the foreign secretary was being interviewed by some reporterette from the BBC, and he just said, "No, we don't want to take any because they're not really compatible with our country because we're a Christian country." And she's like, "Oh, how dare you say that?" And but it kind of makes sense. And or hey, like Israel, right? They're a Jewish country, man. So I think you always need some sort of religion. Humans, I think, are naturally a religious creature,
Hmm.
and that doesn't mean that we need to force specific practices on people. But I think if we were explicitly in this fantasy society, say, hey, we're officially a Christian society, and we're going to celebrate Christmas, that's sort of our values. And I think that would eliminate some problems uh, with other, because if the idea, you're always going to have religion. And I think a religion has an important quality to it. And I've used this metaphor before, but even if you don't believe in God, there's some good things I think that we all believe in: being kind, treating people ethically, uh, all honesty, respecting people's property, don't kill, don't steal. And if I'm going to use a metaphor, that's kind of like in an orange, that'd be the fruit, the good stuff. And then you have the skin of the fruit, which you really can't eat. And you could say it's not really the good stuff, it's just kind of there around it. And so what's the point of the skin? And you could say, well, there's no reason for the skin. Let's get rid of the skin and we'll just have the fruit. But if you did that, then the fruit would rot pretty quick. And in my metaphor, the skin is sort of the religion. And so even though you could say, why do we need religion? We just need the good stuff, the being honest, being ethical. We don't need the religion, but I think we do need the religion. I think the religion helps protect the people. And I am a Christian personally, but I don't on my streams get too much involved with theological debates. And because I think we can even reach out to people, and we're finding people. That one guy, his name escapes me. He was a comedian, big atheist type of guy. You may know it. Boy, I forget his name, but he's now lamenting how they're trying to get rid of Christmas and the word Christmas, even in the UK. And I'm like, well, dude, you've been attacking Christianity. That what do you expect to happen?
Hmm.
And I think we do need that structure in a society. So, as this has been a long way to answer your question. I wouldn't necessarily have like force people to go to church or something like that, but I would make this society officially Christian. Now, if you're actually pagan and whatever, that's fine. But the society is officially Christian.
Hmm. If I may, kind of bring it back to Europe very quickly to make my point of how I see it. Um, so during the High Middle Ages, for example, what you have had is European kingdoms, European governments that competed amongst each other. They even though they had a lot of common heritage. I mean, they're pretty much all from descended from the Germanic tribes in Western Europe. They were fighting amongst themselves. Mm, and it was clear that there is a thread that connects them all, and that is of course Christianity and amongst other things, but primarily Christianity. And when let's say an outside force like Islam, or Islam specifically during that time, as it has now conquered Iberia, so present Spain, pretty much all of it apart from the north. It has encroached onto the lands of the Eastern Roman Empire. It has taken over northern Africa, which was also under the control of the Romans for a while. And of course, Alexandria has been built also by Europeans and so on. So these were lands that Europeans have possessed and they have lived in for a long time. And perhaps, if not for the unifying figure of the Pope, of the unifying figure of the Church, as this kind of a monarch presiding over all monarchs in Europe. we wouldn't have been able to push back against a lot of these invasions, that they would have ultimately eaten us alive. So, of course, France and England, as usual, but also at the time specifically, were at each other's throats. However, it was by popes' passionate speeches and invoking the idea of Christendom that they were able to unite, put aside swords for put aside differences for a period of time to try to save something that is common to us all, which is this idea of Christendom. So, I also see the church as not just a national unifier, but also, I believe, an international unifier, and it also, I believe, can work as a check on on monarchies, individual power of monarchies also. But we can explore that endlessly. But that's kind of my outlook on it, specifically in Europe. Of course, the situation is different in the US, but yeah. So now we're on that path of discussing history, and this is something that I also like to bring up, which is that history is full of nuance. I mean, it's almost an idiotic statement, and I'm sorry for making it, but it does seem like when we're discussing history today, or in popular circles amongst each other, there seems to be this, this eternal damnation that we cast upon anything that isn't new. That and we for example we single out particular periods that we like, and we forget all the bad that's happened, or we we uh, we pick a period we don't like, and then we elevate all the bad that's happened, and we forget all the good. I think something very important that, for example, the early church fathers like Augustine are talking about, is that we as Christians must not be ignorant um, to the nuance of history. We mustn't say that history, for lack of a better term, is not black and white. And when we're discussing these issues, we can always find a way to condemn the period. We also need to kind of look at it realistically and see whether we can extract anything positive. And I think that's how it always and is in total opposition to the way history is viewed now. Colonial Europe during the period of discovery, bad. Crusades, bad. This bad. I mean, it's so unrealistic, and obviously it's so not true. I don't know if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems people have, I think, when looking at history is we try to put people in their times in our times, or put our times
Yes.
values on their times, and it is so absurd in both ways. Because I'm sure people, let's say 1,000 years ago, the idea that, hey, this dude is going to wear a dress, and we're going to cut off his testicles, and we're going to call him a girl, they would think this is totally insane. I would agree with them on that. But so every era has different views of how they look at things, and just in general, societies, they never, for the most part, felt guilt about being successful in military defeats or conquering the enemies. That was very foreign. And how guilt has tried to be used against our people when no other nations ever had that guilt. Do you think like the Mongols ever had guilt about killing all those people? Of course not. That was like, you couldn't have used guilt against them, because in their minds that meant they were pleasing the gods. They were successful. They were killing their enemy, and that was how things were done. And it was done in America. A lot of people bring up. We hear the liberals, they always complain about the Indians and how we stole their land. Here's a historical example. Well, the Indians, first of all, they weren't monolithic. There was different tribes. They fought each other. They engaged in slavery. They would take each other as slaves. So slavery existed in what's now America before it was America. And no one seems to have an issue with that. They're like, yeah, okay, these different tribes would take over each other's territory. Some cases, they committed genocide against other tribes. And most modern liberals wouldn't have a problem with that. Well, that was their ways. But for some reason, when the English came over, it's like, oh, this is horrible. And I'm like, well, why is that horrible? Shouldn't we just consider them like another Indian tribe that happened to be across the pond? Why are you
Mm.
saying that you should be in a different type of category? So it gets them in a bind because they got to think that, oh no, but because white people are in a different racial category than non-whites, they can't do that. But then they have like this double standard that they can't really explain. So I'm just saying, well, just pretend we were like the Cherokee Indians or something that were successful. And in a sense, people in that era and how they thought is they had a view of themselves that their culture was right, their religion was right, and when it came to European culture compared to other cultures, I'm not saying there weren't flaws, there weren't some hardships that they imposed on the natives, but compared to other nations did it, it was quite mild, and it was actually there was a sense of like we want to bring these people up, we want to Christianize them. Look how horrible conditions there are. Not all the time, I get it, but um, we have someone on our roundtable. He's Japanese, and he was talking about ancient Japan, how there are different tribes, and they would try to exterminate each other, and that was just the way it was. So it's very difficult when you look in the past to try to impose our values, which our
Mm.
values now could change in a heartbeat and on those people. So I think that's the trick of history. That's it gets a little ridiculous. I mean, just recently they did some archaeological dig in Pompeii, I think it was, and the BBC. That article, they were shocked. They found what they felt was homophobic graffiti that the Romans used back then. And it's like, oh, how dare they be homophobic back then? I'm like, oh, good grief! It's like, of course, it's like it's really strange and it's very I don't know if I want to use the word prejudice or bigoted or we have a view of ourselves that we're at the apex, that we're the smartest, we have the right thing, and all our popular morality now is the right morality, and everyone out throughout history was kind of beneath us and how stupid they were to have these opinions. When I think that's rather arrogant to have that position, and so I think that's the problem with dealing in history is to put that, as you said, in the nuance. You got to look at it for its time. You got to look for it for their motivations. A lot of people don't do that now, but I also love history.
Yes, I just picking up on the point of the Mongols, of course, who have pretty enslaved nations for for a very long time. I also would like to mention the same Muslims who conquered Iberia and who conquered all these previously Roman territories. And after the fall of Western Rome, what you had is because Rome was no longer able to fend off piracy, and so on.
Mhm.
They had no longer had control of the Mediterranean. What you had is this Islamic kind of piracy going on, and they would take thousands upon thousands of people in raids in Sicily, even in Iberia, everywhere in the Eastern Roman Empire. They would take Europeans as slaves by their thousands, and this. Uh, I can tell you that the condition into which these slaves were placed weren't very pleasant, to say the least, and they were far less lenient than even something under the Roman government, uh, where a slave could buy his freedom, even. But and all of this just makes me a bit slightly disappointed, shall we say, because these people right now say that we ought to be ashamed of ourselves, we ought to be ashamed of our history, of our heritage, of who we are, even though, and this, I have to say this, even though when we've colonized all these places, I'm going to put this as nicely as possible, but these places were not nice. These places didn't really, let's say, they weren't ponies and clouds and rainbows. And certainly they weren't very technologically advanced. They weren't philosophically advanced. They weren't advanced in terms of governmental structure. There was nothing there. It was just tribes fighting against each other in all of these places. What the Europeans have brought, they brought technology, they brought philosophy, they brought the light of the faith to these people, and of course there was conflict. I mean, just as you've said, conflict is is inevitable amongst tribes. But I feel like we have brought these colonies so much that it pains me now to see that we've surrendered all of this, that we now get all this flack and this hatred from these from these places as we are being now colonized by them. So this is I believe this is the most tragic part about this is that we have kind of tried to do our best. We have tried to really, and I'm not saying that we did everything perfectly, but we brought a lot to these places like Africa and India and America and so on and so forth. Do you think that this idea we have learned our lesson? Do you think that now you would say, actually, let's just stop. We just need to focus upon ourselves, and we need to stop looking kind of to help. Let's just say to enlighten, to support all these places because the experiment has failed, or do you think there is still some hope, despite, let's say, some intellectual troubles or societal troubles that they might have in these continents, to improve their lives?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and one of the questions when I was thinking of, you're saying, "Do we and we? What do we mean by we?" And we're such different types of people, and with different goals, because you have like the Russians from your heritage, and you have like the English and the French, and then now the Americans. So that's sort of a complex question, but I would say in general there's a little bit of envy because our people in general were able to create modern civilization, came really mostly out of Europe. I would say 95% or more, and specifically Northwest Europe. And nothing against our Russian friends, but that was sort of the driver of the modern way of doing things. And I think there's a tension because there's sort of an envy, like, well, we kind of hate you for what you built that we can't build.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, we want to be part of that. We don't want to lose that. So it's a weird there's a thing in kind of a saying. It's probably worldwide, but if you want to get someone to hate you and be real resentful, just keep giving them charity and handouts. They'll eventually hate you. They really will because they become very envious, or not, they don't become they don't have a sense of gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not even talking races. I'm just talking within a race. If you do this to someone, they get very angry about it because people need to find their own way. I have often advocated what probably should have been done is the old. Did you ever watch Star Trek? I don't know if you remember that
No,
show.
no, I'm not big on Star Trek now.
Okay, but they had what they called the Prime Directive. At least when the original Star Trek, they always broke it, but the Prime Directive is any culture that you find, you should just leave them like they are if they're below
Mm-hmm.
you in technology, and don't interfere, don't give them stuff, just leave them alone. I think actually we've done that with this, like one, there's this little small island that's still in the Stone Age near India. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, I
It's
think so. Yes.
Yeah, there was like rules, no one can
Mm-hmm.
go there. We're still like literally in the Stone Age. We don't know how many people there, maybe a couple hundred. But we're like, no, they should just, live their lives free. They don't know how to make boats or anything, so just leave them there. And I think probably that maybe should have been our policy. And I think that's probably the better policy going forward.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be my policy as a country. Like if I was, let's say, the hypothetical king of a kingdom, the kingdom of Ramsey Paul, my philosophy would in certain countries would be, hey, we don't have any quarrels with them, but we need to leave them be. We shouldn't try to fix them. And there is a truth to this whole idea of white supremacy where we, especially even leftists, have it where we think everyone should be like us. And a recent example the United States ran into is Afghanistan. It's like, oh my gosh, we have all these primitive tribesmen and they don't understand queer theory properly. We need to go over there. We need to educate them so they could be like us, and women can be empowered and vote and this and that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really arrogant because we're trying to push our values on them and they don't necessarily want those values. But we're kind of assuming our values are superior. So here we need to educate these people. Now, going back historically, a lot of the people, they weren't doing this just to exploit people. People really did believe in Christianity. They really believed literally,
Mm-hmm.
and I do too, but a lot of us still literally believe in it. But back then they really did. And they thought if you didn't know Christ, you're going to hell potentially. So when they would evangelize to people, you have missionaries, they literally weren't doing it to have some secret agenda to exploit the people. They really had the heart for these people to try to save them, and they saw their circumstances like how savage and primitive. We need to help these people out of this situation, which in some ways may have been good, but then it does breed resentment. And I think what we see now is a lot of resentment, and we haven't really solved that problem. I think the best way to solve this is just different people have their own homelands and they go on as they wish. And we kind of have our prime directive. Let's not try to fix them. Let's let them do as they wish, and we'll be on friendly terms with them. So that's kind of how I see all of that with the colonialization and all that type of stuff. And I don't have any zero guilt about history. I can't even imagine it.
Hmm.
First of all, as a person, I can only be guilty, in my opinion, what I've done in my life. Someone else, what they do, that doesn't put guilt on me whatsoever. It's a weird concept. I don't even subscribe to that position, so it's never worked on me. Maybe I'm different, like this whole white guilt thing. I never had it. 0% at all. Just rolls off me. Maybe some people have it. I don't know, but I'm for some reason immune to it. And I think more and more people are becoming that way. It's just like, hey, we're just people like everyone else, and we have our own interests, and people of all nations have their interest, and things work a certain way in the real world, and this is how it is.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that my take on it is that I think the colonization and all of this was done out of the goodness of their heart, partially, a lot of it, as you have said, out of Christian goodness of heart. Uh, and I mean, they were a bit naive, I would say, because obviously I mean, you can't fault them for it. I mean, this is the new world, new places, new territories, new people that they're discovering. And I think now we have the hindsight to see that perhaps, as you have said, not all people can be like us, and nor should nor should we force them to be like us. Even though we are called to evangelize, of course, but that is, I think, a very nuanced topic that we can go into. But I do think that for now, we have so many internal troubles. We have so much turmoil in our own countries that what we really must do is focus on ourselves instead of looking overseas, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I
yeah,
definitely agree with that.
yeah. So, and in terms of discussing history and colonialism and so on, we can we can't really discuss colonialism freely, but we kind of also can. It's not the same severity as other questions. So this brings up an interesting topic in my mind, which is the expiration date, as I would call it, of historic events. Now, what I mean by that is, for example, you can pretty much freely right now talk about the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, there isn't really much anything controversial, right? I mean, the vast majority of people, I mean, they've heard of Napoleon, but they would have no idea what you're even talking about. They wouldn't be able to name a single date. So we can really talk, and it varies in different countries, of course, but we can talk what we like about that particular war. Now, moving on to other wars that were more recent, let's say World War One and World War Two in specifically, we cannot talk about these wars honestly. We cannot talk about them honestly, and it is put pretty clear because we will face persecution. So, do you think in that what? How do you think this will resolve? When do you think will we be able to talk about World War II, if ever, honestly, truthfully, without a fear of censorship, just like we talk about Napoleon?
Well, that depends when you can have your own self-determination.
Mm,
That's really the key thing. I mean, sometimes I don't know if there is an expiration date necessarily, but it depends on. Let's go back to Islam. I don't think there's an expiration date in an Islamic country when you could start really looking at Muhammad and saying bad things potentially about
mm,
him. They just want to tolerate that, even in 100, 200 years necessarily. So I think it depends on how the country is
mhm,
structured and that type of thing. But yeah, I think historical events, and at least based on the Enlightenment and our Western European tradition, any historical event you should be allowed to discuss freely. We can't in It really started. I was really shocked when with the one subject that came up about World War II. I even have to refer to it like that. But that when I was younger, I was first shocked when I heard people saying that you shouldn't be able to discuss that in a way. I'm like, well, that's bizarre because you should be able to discuss and debate. That's part of the scientific method. And everyone says, "Oh, I love effing science." Well, part of science is being able to look at it and debate, and you may disagree or agree or whatever, but they try to make this like, oh, but if you say the wrong thing about that, must mean you have hate in your heart. It's very bizarre how we try to attribute emotion to looking at something, because first of all, it doesn't really matter. Even if you do have hate in your heart, if you're right, you're right, it doesn't matter. But it's sort of the society that we're kind of in now. So I think it depends on the society. For example, if you're in the Soviet Union, when could you really say that, oh, maybe the revolution sucked, Lenin sucked? You probably couldn't do that. But once it
Hmm.
fell, you could speak more honestly about it.
Hmm.
And so it depends on the society. If you have a free society, like the United States was pretty free until recently, you could discuss any topic. Now, as you may be aware, you're not American, but we technically, legally can discuss any topic and
Of
we won't
course.
be arrested. But unlike Europe, in Europe, you can be
Hmm.
arrested for talking about certain topics. But it's a de facto censorship, like, oh, you can lose your job, you can be kicked off all
Yep.
social media. You could, so they have pressures to silence you, which I don't think is healthy. I think it's healthy to be able to discuss all positions, and I put my own category. Even positions I hold that people disagree with, I think they should be allowed to discuss those positions. But sadly, we don't live in that situation. So to get to your point, I don't think it's so much as based on time limit. It's based on how does it impact current politics. So Napoleon, I don't think many people, there's not any factions that their power is derived from what happened in the after the French Revolution, really.
Hmm.
Whereas there's a lot of groups in power that they gain their victimhood and they get a little past because of what they say happened in World War II, or not even just World War II, but let's say in Turkey, for example, with the in the Ottomans and how the Armenian genocide, I think it was, and even there, that's a touchy issue because see, people they can gain some they think victimhood out of it, and because our society plays such a high role in victimhood, it's a type of currency that can be used, which I brought up earlier in our conversation, which is kind of strange because throughout most of history, being a victim wasn't necessarily something that gave you any currency. Like, hey, we were the victims. If you went to Genghis Khan and said, hey, you killed 60 million of our people, he probably would have said, well, praise gods. That
Yeah.
shows the gods were on my side. It wouldn't have caused anything, but they're kind of playing on something that we have that is unjust. So that's why it's used. So I guess to answer your question, if people that currently live are making political hay out of a topic, and that includes some events in World War II, that includes slavery, that includes colonialism, that includes, let's say, the American Indian type thing, it will stay that way as long as the people can gain something out of it. And how long that is depends on the current politics of the day. I don't think there's necessarily a specific time limit on it.
Mm. Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. I think that all these historical events are, as I think actually throughout history, have are used for propaganda purposes. It's as simple as
Hmm.
that, right? So if a particular event is relevant to the current agenda, then it will be relevant and it will be monitored and censored. And if it isn't, then well, we don't care. You can go have your little autistic discussions about Napoleon and so on and whatnot. But the reason why kind of a time frame, why I believe it's relevant, is because also, I mean, we have no real family or otherwise connection to the Napoleonic era really on a practical level. Whereas with the world wars, it's still kind of a bit fresh in our memory. So that's where I was kind of going from. Is you go back 2 generations, and there you see people who are actually dealing with the fallout of all of this. So I think recency, up to a point, may have a certain effect. So I think that I think if more time passes and as people who, these events kind of vanish from our immediate memory, will be able to more freely discuss this. But obviously, that will only be effective to a certain point, because if it is going to be relevant in the propaganda campaigns, then there is really nothing we can do about it. But yeah, so in terms of the United States, I wanted to, you are correct. In Europe, we have this terrible legalistic, draconian regime that is instituted, partially or greatly by the EU, for example. It's a very tyrannical organization that. I mean, this is a totally separate topic, but in terms of talking about American issues and kind of moving on to perhaps a bit of a white pill, I'm going to share this. I'm going to share this little article with you right now, and I think the stream will be able to see it. But I'll just read through what it says. It's a BBC article. I'll read it through. I'll read a couple of points from it for you, Mr. Ramsey. So it's entitled "Supreme Court: Top U.S. Judges Signal Support for Abortion Limits." And that is something when I have seen this, I was thinking maybe there is a potential for a white pill here. And what it was talking about, of course, we see on the pictures the usual slew of crazy characters with their little signs and their pink hair, and so on and so forth. But in this article, it does say that potentially we will have it's possible that Roe v. Wade may be overturned, in fact, or that even if not overturned, abortion, it will be more difficult to access abortion in the future in the United States. So what they're getting at is it's not likely that the state of abortion in the US is going to remain totally the same. And in light of that, how would you unpack the situation right now that is going on for someone who isn't totally involved with US politics? Do you think that it's going to have any a significant impact for the pro-life cause? And how do you see this develop?
Yeah, there's a couple of aspects when it comes to abortion. There's kind of the moral aspect argument, and there's a legal aspect. Legally, Roe versus Wade was silly, it was stupid.
Yes.
The Constitution, there's nothing in the Constitution that says the states must allow for abortions. Now, how our government was set up for the foreign audience, we're composed of states, and for years people would refer to us as those United States, and it was like a plural. And we came together as a country, but we still have separate states. And the way the Constitution is set up originally, and it's still this way theoretically, is the federal government has certain powers, and all other power goes to the individual states, all the other powers. Now, there are Bill of Rights. So if you're a member of the Union, you have to, like the First Amendment, you have to respect the freedom of religion and free speech. So Texas can't pass a law saying you can't attend a Catholic church in Texas. So that would be illegal because they're part of the United States government. We have the First Amendment. But outside what's in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution, it goes to the states. Abortion was never mentioned. The founding people that created the Constitution, they never realized it was in the Constitution. But we have some activist judges that somehow thought it was part of the Constitution. Horrible law. So if you take out the moral thing, like if you're for abortion or opposed to it, forget that. Just look at this legally. It has no business being on a federal level. So just to be clear, for people that are outside the United States or even inside the United States, people I think are kind of, they're not well informed, and they think, oh, well, if Roe versus Wade is overturned, that means abortion is now illegal in the United States. No, it doesn't mean that. It means the matter goes back to the states. And some states, like let's say California or New York, I mean, they will still have abortion through the 9th month, no doubt about it. Other states, let's say like Texas, or I'm in Arkansas, will probably put some more restrictions on it. I doubt they would totally ban it, but they would put I think most people are pretty squeamish about the idea of these late-term abortions. So I think a lot of states, probably most states, would not allow abortion after a certain time period, and there would be restrictions on it. So um, you can talk about this in two different ways, and I can talk about either way. If you want to talk about the morality of it versus the legality of it, but the legality of it, in my opinion, is pretty clear cut. It should be up to the states, and if people think that abortion is somehow should be a right for every state, they should pass an amendment to the Constitution, which is very difficult to do when it happened. Otherwise, it should be a state issue. And I'm opposed to abortion personally because I'm opposed to taking an innocent life, and I think a baby is not the mother. It lives in the mother, but it's a fetus, has its own DNA. It's separate from the mother, and we should not kill innocent life. And um, I think that's my position on abortion. So I'm opposed to it morally, but legally, I don't think there's any reason it should be on a federal level. And but practically, what will happen, just so you guys know, it's not going to make abortion illegal. In fact, in some places, there won't be any changes whatsoever.
Yes, but there is a potential for some kind of a victory here, isn't there? That
Oh,
abortion may
definitely.
become or maybe much harder or impossible to attain in some states.
Harder, yeah, not and again, I think almost every state will have some type of abortion,
Hmm.
which I don't know why you'd wait so long for abortion anyway. This is a very strange thing that someone would wait that far in their pregnancy. But yeah, it, it is a, if you're opposed to abortion, this is a white pill. This is progress, and I think there we'll have to see how the court rules. And of course, if they do overturn Roe versus Wade, you'll see the usual people screaming in the streets. Usually, these older women that aren't going to have children anyway, but that's what you'll see. And I don't know. I don't know how they'll rule on that. But yeah, that is good that this issue is still being uh, in the news because I think it's how we treat people this way is very important.
Yeah, I think I've seen they posted a chart actually. Even the BBC, which is not a trustworthy news source. I can tell you that for a fact. Even they have posted a graph showing a difference between a difference to kind of abortion sentiment in the US amongst all the states between 2000 and 2020, and what they have seen is pretty much all of this, not all of the states, but a lot of them, a great lot of them, have become more conservative on, or when they poll people on this issue of abortion. So I think this is great to see, and I think that this is, if it will be a victory, is going to be a white pill to us, to the pro-life movement. Um, so
Yeah, and if I could jump
yeah,
in,
of
I
course.
think technology has played a part in that because years ago you could just say it was like a clump of cells or whatever until the baby was born. But but now everyone that has children, and I'm sure where you live is the same way. You get ultrasounds, you can see the baby.
Hmm.
The baby sucks its thumb. The baby can actually hear noises. The baby feels pain. It's not a clump of cells after a certain point, and technology shows that pretty vividly. So I think technology has been a way to kind of show really what's involved here, that you are dealing with a human life. So I get a little squeamish of killing innocent human life personally.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. It's the I love F in science only works so far. It only goes so far as to propagate what you already believe. But when it doesn't, when you've got separate DNA, when you've got heartbeat, when you can see that it's a separate human person, you can see that. Then suddenly, it's not I love F in science, is it? But picking up on this technology. Uh, Topic. This is actually so important, and I think we see this in pretty much all aspects. Of course, technology has consumed us as a species, I believe, and from medicine to even currency or economics, right? We now see perhaps a move on to digital currencies. Not that money wasn't already digital with with banks and so on and so forth with credit cards, but specifically kind of this new, what many have, a utopian vision of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and so on and so forth. Now, as a kind of conservative who looks back and likes physical things. I believe life is a physical thing, right? You hug people, you meet people, you shake hands, you pay with money that you hold. You put some let's say some used to be coins under the pillow of children when they lose their teeth and so on and so forth. That's and it's such a big part of all this. Now, as we move on to, as our society, let's say, digitalizes, for lack of a better word, as our physical contact reduces and everything moves, so to speak, to the cloud, I really see in that a fundamental challenge to us as human beings. And my question is, I suppose, uh, and that will ultimately culminate, I believe, in this kind of sci-fi thing where we're just going to be connected up to a computer with our little flimsy bodies and living in this kind of dream slash nightmare, digital dream slash digital nightmare kind of thing. But in either case, there may be some kind of technological dystopia awaiting us. And my question to do with that is, do you agree? Do you see technology as not just, of course, allowing us to make all these accomplishments, but also subversing our nature, as challenging and attacking our nature as human beings? And if so, can it be? Do you think contained? And if so, should it be contained?
Yeah, good questions. I'd first start out saying I think man is basically a technological animal, meaning unlike all other animals that I can think of, we're the only ones to use
Hmm.
tools. I think apes, there's some apes that can use like a stick to get ants out of an anthill or something. So, but to really make it and beavers make dams and stuff like that. But we're the ones really to make tools and use
Yeah.
technology. And humankind has always kind of gone through a little bit of technology. I mean, there's a great technological agriculture. Before
Hmm.
agriculture, people lived in small tribes. They would hunt like the mammoth, and they would be traveling. And then agriculture really allowed for the invention of the city state. And that was a radically different, it changed us as a people. So I think we are by nature technological animals. Now, I agree with you, especially how technology can be bad for us, and I don't know. I mean, I'm an old guy now, so I can remember when I was young. I would have said, if you asked me what would life be in 2021, I would say, well, I imagine like I would be have maybe a house on Mars, and then I would take a spaceship to the moon, and everyone was sure that would be the way things would happen, and everyone have flying cars. Or we'd all be killed in a nuclear war because all the experts say we were 1 minute from midnight to dying, and a lot of this didn't happen, obviously. So you got to be careful of extrapolating like what's happened recent to keep going, because there's other
Hmm.
pressures against technology. And you could almost see a change of how people use technology. You could see it legally, you could see it based on society. If, let's say, we have a collapse, would the technology still be the same? It'd be, I think, quite different, and people wouldn't rely on it as much. So I think technology, as us as humans, will always be around, and it will always be increasing and changing. But I don't necessarily think it would end up like the Matrix, where we're just hooked up to a computer. I could be wrong. It's hard to predict the future, but I don't necessarily think that's. I hope maybe I don't think it will necessarily go with that, because a lot of people are already seeing the dangers and how damaging a lot of the technology has become. And I could see in a future like where they put limits on how much time children can spend on technology so they get out and play. I could see various governments in the future doing something like that to limit the access of technology. That's another question if we should. There's pros and cons. So, it's hard to really predict. But yeah, technology, I think there's been a lot of good things from it, but yeah, it has, I think, in many ways, increased tensions because people of us all communicating, it hasn't necessarily ended hatreds. I think it's
Mm,
exasperated them.
mhm.
But there's a lot of good things. Like I'm talking to you now because of technology. This
Yeah.
would have been impossible. This is like magic from when I was a kid. The idea that you could be in real time talking to someone in Europe, but it just that wouldn't be impossible. Calling Europe was like a major to do, and it'd be so expensive. You'd only could spend a few seconds. So it has opened a lot of things up, but there's also a lot of negatives. So I think we humans will sort of navigate our way through this based on the pitfalls we see.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you that man is ultimately a technological creature, and that is fine. I'm not opposed to, the use of technology. I'm opposed to the abuse of technology, and that is kind of as we are, the kind of accomplishments we have made in the past couple of decades have been so monumental, have been so exponential that we've never seen such a rise in technology. And I was just perhaps fearful, perhaps cautious of it, and just to see that it doesn't fundamentally alter our lives. That's kind of my worry. And when you brought up the kind of limits on children accessing the web or technology and so on, that's exactly what I was getting at. Is that uh,
Yep.
perhaps when it becomes too invasive, and which I argue it's already become and is certainly becoming more so, uh, that we'll have to start limiting its advancement. And I think bringing back to practically speaking, I think a practical matter to showcase this is actually something. I believe is a topic in the U.S. right now, and of course, folks, correct me if I'm wrong, but the kind of the trucking industry, right? People going back and forth and bringing goods between states and so on. That is a huge industry in the United States, and what you see now is the kind of the early stages of the advent of technology that will allow driverless um, cars to bring goods in between the states, and obviously that worries people. That ultimately throws so many out of employment. That kind of challenges and totally kind of erases the human part of such an important and historically relevant industry that a lot of people are attached to. So putting it in practical terms, for example, in that case, would you see limiting technology like banning self-driving cars, for example? Would you consider it in that case?
Yeah, that's interesting, and I'll answer the question about technology and the
Mm-hmm.
job formation stuff. But I just thought of another thing I should have mentioned. It's kind of funny, but I don't know your age, but when I was a kid, we had something. We had record players,
Mm-hmm.
and then all of a sudden the CDs came in and digital and record players and records were considered obsolete. I had a lot of records I got rid of, but now we have a resurgence in the United States. People love vinyl. They're going back to it.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
have one. It's like it's really popular again. So it's like going backwards in technology, but people enjoy it. And like with books, um, my father, he's still in his 80s, but he goes to his websites and he prints out he goes to lourockwell.com and he prints out all the articles. Then he reads them in his easy chair. He doesn't want to read on a computer. I still like real books versus reading on the computer, to be honest. So I think there's ways that we can kind of go back to the old, and there's some limits to the future. Now, answering your question about technology and um, the economy. This is a very important topic, and Andrew Yang really brought this up, and a lot of people were. And it gets shut down too easily by people. Oh, you're just a luddite because, and those guys were wrong because they thought we'd get improved farm machinery. It would eliminate all the farmers. Well, all those people just went to the cities and got factory jobs. So see, you're wrong. This proves that it's
Mm-hmm.
wrong. And I'm like, well, that one specific incident, yeah, that Luddites were wrong for that time, but that doesn't logically mean that they're always wrong. And you could theoretically get to a point, you could do a thought experiment. I'm not saying we'd ever get to that point, but thought experiments are fun.
Mm-hmm.
What if you could have a robot that could do exactly everything a human can do? Exactly, there's no difference. Forget about I mean, there's a lot of implications to that,
Mm-hmm.
but that could eliminate people selling their labor to live. And how we live right now is by selling our labor. And if you can't sell your labor, what do you do? Die, starve? I mean, I don't think that's how humans want to live. So I do think this is an important topic that really hasn't been addressed very much. I mean, people early on were talking about this, and Andrew Yang was, and I don't necessarily like him for all his positions,
Hmm.
but he was one of the first major guys to bring this up as an issue. And it's an issue that I don't think is going to go away, that we need to address it. And how do we address this as a society? How do people live if they can't sell their labor? And I hate all the arguments against it, like the Luddites. Yeah, in that situation, the jobs just went to the cities, but where are the jobs going to go now? And
Mm.
then people say, well, you got to have people to fix the robots. I'm like, okay, but if you eliminate, say, 1,000 jobs, and then you create 5 new jobs to fix the robots, you still have a net loss of 995 jobs. So you
Hmm.
still have an issue. And so I think this is an issue that's important that needs to be looked at. And this is my solution is if you had a government, and again, like the government I talked in my ideal society, you could set up things like, I don't know, have shorter work weeks, maybe provide incentives for women. They don't have to be in the workplace.
Hmm.
They can still have a high standard of living. Because just imagine if a lot of women could get out of the workplace, they wouldn't have to work if they choose not to. That would increase the wages for the men, and then the women could a lot of times focus on really what they love. So, but the important thing is people need a purpose in their life. And the problem is sort of like with the internet. I'm old enough to remember when the internet came out, everyone said, oh, this is going to be so great because now at your fingertips, everyone's going to go on the internet and look up all the scientific stuff and historical stuff and literature and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, well, some people do, but like, what is that? Like 90% is porn. So it hasn't really been used for how they designed it. And that's the issue. Like, if people don't work, you think, oh, well, that give them time to do artistic endeavors or write novels or do all these creative stuff. I'm like, no, they'll probably just watch porn and masturbate all day. That's
Mm.
the reality of it. So you need to have, I think humans need a purpose because that's how we're wired. I had a dog. I love dogs, and dogs need a purpose. And one of the things I learned about dog training, if you don't give a dog a purpose in life, it gets really depressed. And
Mm.
that's why you should train your dog, have it do tricks. My dog always made it do a trick before it got fed. I wasn't being cruel. The dog loved it. It was a way for him to think, I'm fulfilling my function as a dog, even though it's kind of silly, shake hands or whatever, but it gives them a purpose. And I think we as humans need a purpose in our life. I really do believe that. And just sitting around doing nothing, I don't think we talked about, then we start talking about idle hands. That tends to cause more troubles and it causes a lot of frustrations. And I think we're seeing that issue. So I do see this is really an important issue that most politicians are not talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And funny you mention this kind of if everyone has so much free time, we can just all be artists or architects, or we can do sculpture
Right.
or write books or something. And this is actually exactly what the kind of the early socialists of the 19th century thought. These aristocrats, right? They sat there and they thought, life is so good for us, right? We've got, I mean, it's fantastic. We've got all these beautiful buildings and oh, we've got such an advanced society and so on and so forth. It's such a shame that the plebs, the normal people, they can't do all of this stuff because and that must be because we're not allowing them to. Surely, if we educate everyone, if we send everyone to schools, if they get off the farms and actually have free time, they will all be Raphaels and Da Vinci's and Rubens and Vivaldis of the world and all of that stuff. I think they actually did have a romantic view of this, but this has clearly been debunked. I mean, if the 20th century is going to give us any lesson, that is definitely debunked. If you give people free time, if you give them unlimited access to information, if you pretty much create a utopia for them. They will, as you have pointed out, Mr. Ramsey, all they will do is watch porn and masturbate. That is exactly right, and that is tragic, but it is true. But also, you mentioned going back and books and nostalgia and vinyl. I think actually, vinyl has this kind of advantage, even from a technological standpoint, that the sound quality may be better than digital recordings, for example. So a lot of audiophiles prefer that as well because of it. But no matter, just an aside. What I wanted to ask is, nostalgia is so important. I don't know if it's just if it's a conservative trait, if it's a Russian trait, or whichever where I get that from. But I'm very nostalgic. I'm very young. You asked me about my age. I'm 23, but I'm still nostalgic about my childhood. I have this kind of idyllic image, and I had a great childhood, so I'm very nostalgic about it. And especially when I go back to the country from which my family hails, and I see, and I remember when I was there, when I see all these our old houses, and meet with people with whom I grew up with. It's really I'm almost on a permanent nostalgia trip, which is not probably very healthy sounding, but I just quite like reminiscing in the past. And I wanted to ask you, out of your kind of maybe childhood or adolescence, or whatever, what what kind of nostalgic moments get you the most? What do you reminisce about, or are you not a nostalgic person at all?
No, I definitely have nostalgia, especially during this time of year, Christmas, because you can think back to the people that you loved. You probably don't know it as much because you're so young, but as you get older, you have grandparents you can remember having times with, and it doesn't seem that long ago, and they're all dead now, and it shows you how short life is. And I get nostalgic about the old America when I look back on it because I can remember it, and it was a lot better, even though we didn't have all the technology. But it was a much more optimistic country. It wasn't perfect. There was always issues. You got to be careful you don't look back with rose-colored glasses because
Hmm.
even back then, people that lived then they had nostalgia from years ago, and I think you got to be careful. You don't want to live in the past, and
Yes.
part of the problem we have with we'll circle back to that generational thing, and one problem older people do have, and this is true, boomers have it, but before then their parents had it. You tend to be stuck in the age where you reached your development as an adult,
Hmm.
your high school, college years, and your tastes tend to stay that way, and that's okay. I mean, I think that's just natural, but you got to stay current with what's really happening. In some ways, it doesn't matter. I consider myself one of the first generation X. Some people call me a boomer, whatever. But I like the music from that era. I really
Hmm.
do, and I haven't bothered to keep up with new music because I don't. I think it's junk. Although recently I'm really a lot more into classical music. I
Mm.
consider that more fascinating. So I'm listening to a lot of that. But I think there's a little bit of that. But when it gets into politics, you got to be careful that you don't see things that are no longer the way
Mm.
they are. And as I brought up, a lot of the baby boomers, they grew up in a white America. It's almost America was 90% white, but in most areas it's 100% white because of how things were segregated. So you could live your whole life and really have almost no experience with someone of another race, or maybe one or two at the most. So a lot of these boomers, they are thinking of a day when they lived in a vastly majority white areas,
Mm.
and they always look at this as, oh, well, these minorities that are being victimized and so forth, and it's hard for them to really understand how things have changed and the reality of the situation because we have an idealized look of how things should be. And it's just not, by the way, generations, it's geographic. I don't know if you saw that a video that went viral. The girl kind of got in some trouble for it. Japanese girl, and she went to Paris, and she just well, like, where the hell are all the Frenchmen? Because it wasn't really French she saw there, and she wanted to go to Paris to see Frenchmen, which is not unreasonable. Like if I went to London, I want to see a bunch of English, and nothing against other nationalities, but you go there and you're like, what the hell happened? This is not what I want. And so you get nostalgic about the past and of having homelands and the connection to your people, and so there is nostalgia there. But I think we can use nostalgia for the future to build on the future of what things can be. We don't have to be despondent and say, "Oh, we can't have that," because we can say we did have it, so it can be done again. Not this exact same way. Things are always different, but we can have things that we want in life, at least to our descendants. And when you get my age, you're just mostly doing this for people you won't see, come after you, but you're hoping to set the framework maybe that can be built upon by young people like yourself So when you're like my age and maybe you will realize some of our goals, you can think of the old guys that maybe planted a few seeds that helped come to fruition. So that's kind of what you do when you get older. So I get nostalgic for the past, but then I think in the future, I get a little, I don't know if you can have nostalgia for the future is probably not the proper way to phrase it,
Yeah.
but I dream of a future that where people can live happy and peace, and we're in a bad time now, but we can come through a good time. And yeah, I know I probably won't see it, but I can hope for my children. I have children, grandchildren, one day maybe they can see it. So I think that's kind of what drives us.
Yeah. Well, what I would like to say is that if you guys have any more, if you guys have any questions, you can either send them through StreamElements, or you can just pop them in the chat, either for me or for Mr. Ramsey, and we'll answer the questions. So in the meantime, I would like to ask you, obviously before all this COVID stuff, and I don't know necessarily what restrictions you face in the US, but we the European Union, and this is so hard to say, but it's unfortunately very predictable. They're now considering mandatory vaccination, which is, I mean, it's an unspeakable horror. But without dwelling on it, but before let's say all of this, uh, how do you like to culturally spend your time? For example, do you enjoy, or did you or do you enjoy going to classical concerts, or perhaps opera or ballet? So or the theater or the cinema. How would you kind of spend the evening if you if you had wanted to spend it kind of with a cultural flavor, shall we say?
Yeah, I did enjoy that in Europe, all the cultural stuff. I mean, to be honest, people don't realize this because I do all this streaming and I do public speaking, but I'm very much an introvert. And when I'm doing a lot of this stuff, for me to recharge, I just like to get a book and I'd like to read it on my own, and I just like it to be quiet. Maybe listen to some Brahms or something in the background. And to me, that's perfect. And maybe with a couple of good friends. I'm not really much of a party guy, and I've never really been that way. I can do it. I can socialize with people, and next week we're having a big party here. Have a lot of people over. It's going to be a lot of fun, but I definitely like my time on my own just to read and think about things and drink my coffee. I've noticed as I get older, I like the smaller things. I get a lot of pleasure out of things that
Mm,
people may not realize. I've chased a lot of things in life that even if you find it's unsatisfactory. You think it will give you a lot of pleasure, and maybe it give you temporary pleasure, but doesn't really bring the happiness. And some of the most happy things that you can have in life are really just simple times where you're with some people you love and you're just having a cup of coffee, you're having a good discussion like we're having now, and with friends. I consider that sometimes the most rewarding things in my life versus major events. And yeah, major events are fun and all that. So, but that's sort of what I do for fun. I haven't been to the movies in a long time. Just because of all, the movies are so woke now and they're
mm,
so political. It's just, I just really can't get into it. And I'm I enjoy classical music a little bit, but I don't really go to concerts just because I don't know. Well, now with all this COVID thing, it's hard to go to stuff like
mm,
that. So I'm kind of an introvert. I just spend times on my own. I love games. That's one of the things. We have a
mm,
gaming club every week, and not every week, every month we have here. We get people over, and I love strategy games. I
mm.
like games from World War II about battle tactics and all that. So that's part of what I like in life too, and I like nature. I feel real at home in the mountains and the woods. I just find it really beautiful.
Mm.
So I love that type of thing in my life right now. Not so much all the, I guess, exciting things that people strive for. I'm kind of, maybe it's my age. I don't know. I'm just not into that as much anymore.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you before you have said that, and not to ask any questions that would be considered too personal, but I wanted to ask you whether you consider yourself an introvert or an extrovert, and you did answer that. I Me personally, I quite like, I don't know, I just love art. I mean, it sounds but proper art. It sounds very benign and boring, but I just nothing can beat proper architecture for me. Nothing can beat a proper painting of of an old master. Nothing can beat a piece of classical music perfectly played for me. So when I'm in this atmosphere, especially when I was in St. Petersburg a couple of years back, and I went to see, for example, the Swan Lake, the ballet. Well, having Russian heritage, the ballet is something that we're very partial to, which
Yeah,
might be.
Tchaikovsky's beautiful. I
Yes,
like Tchaikovsky.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, and this is something that may seem, I don't know, probably a bit weird and snobbish maybe in the US. I don't know, maybe you also enjoy kind of ballet, but this is something. This is still a part of that old European heritage. You know, the operas, the ballets, the concerts, the old architecture, and
Yeah.
when you sit in this. 200-300 year old theater with a royal booth with you know all the paint the ceilings painted and gold everywhere and columns and people and especially when people are unfortunately the audiences have degraded. Many people just are there for because they think it's classy or something, and they just take a picture and they don't really enjoy the art that is actually on display. But when you are soaked in this atmosphere, there's really nothing to beat that for me personally. Um, I don't know if you wanted to jump
Yeah.
in on that.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful, and you're talking about art, and I think it's an expression of our soul.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things that are beautiful in life that get you really emotionally. And it's on the converse side of this, or the flip side. I've been beautiful art in Europe. I saw, then I go into like the modern art exhibit, and it's like an assault on your soul. It's this ugliness,
Mm,
and modern art now, and what they push now is that they try to elevate the ugly and the hideous, and I think it's a real spiritual thing, and I think beauty is something that we should strive for, at least understand it. It's sort of like a taste of God or something,
mm,
whereas the modern is just all about being ugly or being shocking or whatever. And I just find that despicable. So I do love beautiful things, and I love the ballet, like the Swan Lake. I think that's
mm,
very beautiful, Tchaikovsky and all that. And I find all that to be good for the soul. But obviously, because of the politics, it's kind of hard to
mm,
get that anymore. But because they have to put some spin on it,
yeah.
and I don't really care about that. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. Like architecture, when I was in Europe and all the Gothic architecture, I just felt so beautiful. People love it; they really do. And you see the old communist architecture or the more modern architecture, those box buildings, people hate it. They don't
Mm,
even want to be around it. And you should have beauty in how you design buildings because that's part of our soul. And
mm,
it's, I think, an attack on our people when they have this ugly architecture and they push this ugly art. And it's a political, or spiritual for that
mm.
matter.
Absolutely, and it's funny because when I was in St. Petersburg, I actually attended Swan Lake exactly, and thankfully there is still some semblance of pride in Eastern Europe, and especially in Russia, where they try to. Obviously, there are some pretty interesting technology things that on the stage. Modern technology allows you to do, but they're never over the top with it, and they seem to stay very faithful to how people back then would expect a ballet or an opera to be set, for example. So, and I actually sat in a booth, and opposite of me during the break. There was actually an American sitting there, a Texan. So, and we had a very nice conversation. It was quite interesting. I thought that I just this is I think speaks to the unity that to some European semblance of an identity, right? This overarching thing that we can draw from for perhaps unity in the future. And speaking of Russia, we have the very first tip on my stream, which is quite exciting. But someone named Topic Sentence, and he says, "A brilliant stream. Do you think that Russia, which often sees herself as the third Rome, is the future of Western civilization? Will we become more like they are someday?" What do you think about that?
It's an interesting question because a lot of people I talked to in Europe, they were saying like Russians definitely have a different spirit than Western Europeans. And because we were talking about the different ethnicities in Europe, a disclaimer, I have a thing for Russians. I always have, intellectually. I love Tolstoy. I
Mm,
read War and Peace, and I have always, I don't know, I've always uh, had I guess I don't know what it is, but I've always admired. I don't know if admire the word, because Russians they've had a hard time.
mm,
They've had such a history that's really mixed. Been a lot of horrible things, but I have affinity to the Russian
mm,
people, even though I don't have any real connection to them, because my
yeah.
ancestry, I guess, would be is Scottish, which, by the way, I'm proud of. I love the
Hmm.
Scottish people. It's my ancestry, but I've always admired the Russian soul, so to speak. But there is a thought that Western Europeans are quite a bit different, because the thought was Russians tend to be more collectivist in a
Hmm.
mindset, and your Western Europe anyway was more of the individual, like where I'm from. So I don't really know if the Russians are the future. I would like to see a world where definitely they have a place, and other people do too. So I don't want to put down
Hmm.
Western Europe achievements. I think they've been very great, and the Germans, for example, part of my heritage is also German.
Hmm.
I guess I'm the ultimate evil. I'm half German, half Scottish, you know. But yeah, I do. My genes are basically from Western Europe, so that's a disclaimer. But I do have an affinity to the Russians, so I'm not sure if I'm answering this question right. I do admire the Russian people. I wish them well, and but I also, who I am is Western European by nature.
Absolutely. Well, my take on this is regarding Third Rome. There is a lot of historical. It's a historical debate. I'm not going into now. Some would say it is Third Rome. Some would say it isn't. But what I would like to focus on is how Eastern Europe. It seems as if Eastern Europe has more of an immunity to woke ideas. Societies there seem to be more conservative on average, and perhaps this is what the tipper is kind of trying to get at when in the as for example back in the day when Europeans were fleeing communists, or when they were fleeing the destruction of the USSR and the economic hardships and so on that followed, and political turmoil that followed afterwards, as they escaped to the West during all these times. Perhaps if the West grows so unbearable, it grows so tyrannical and so alien to the Europeans in the US or in Western Europe, that perhaps some of them might find refuge in some of the Eastern European countries, including Russia. I think an example of that, I remember watching Orban's interview, Tucker interviewing Orban, and he was mentioning that a lot of Western families actually they search for stability, they search for tradition, they want an escape from all this totalitarian woke crap that is happening in Western Europe, and they're buying property in Hungary and actually moving there for a better, more family friendly life. So I think in that sense we may see, and we're already seeing some of this shift where. But at the same time, we must not over romanticize it. I think Russia has a lot of the same problems that we do. Total godlessness right now. Yes, the Orthodox Church is the official state church, and there is a lot of there are a lot of religious people right now. The young people, and especially not just very young people, but younger people in general, they there is total godlessness. There is very little rule of law, proper rule of law. There is bribery. There is all this stuff. So we of course we must also remember these things, and try to not over romanticize this issue. Um, did you have any thoughts on this?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. And, eventually you're a product of where you're from. I'm an
Hmm.
American for good and bad. And even when I lived in Hungary, I love the people there, but I can never be really Hungarian.
Hmm.
That's not what I am. And I think usually you just have to make a peace of where you are. And maybe someday people would have to move to Hungary or Russia. Most people, that'd be a very difficult thing to do in practical terms. It's kind of a fantasy, but I don't know how much we can keep running. Eventually, eventually we have to make a stand somewhere, and that's sort of my take on it too. But yeah, I wish those people well, and there's a lot of good things. And you're right, you can. They have their problems too, and especially with young people because of the internet. They say the same thing. A lot of the attitudes are really radically different from ours. I think it is a little bit more conservative somewhat, but as you said, you can't idealize it too much. It's not like they're all in traditional garb. It's now they act like when I was hungry, the kids are all looking at fries, right? It's not like it's like American Muslims. So
That is actually this is something I want to talk about, and this ties in with a question we got from the chat. Rich Mountains asked, what has changed the most since Brexit? And I'll try to address that very quickly. Not much at all. So, obviously, promises have been made, and promises, for the most part, in essence, have not been kept. Now, obviously, Britain will no longer have this kind of economically destructive migration from poorer European countries into it, which of course is ruinous for them, as we know. However, do you think they have slowed down with immigration outside of the EU? The answer is no, and what we're going to have is more non-Europeans coming, which doesn't help the issue at all. I mean, I'd rather have Europeans coming than non-Europeans, but they have not slowed down in that sense, and a lot of promises have been made, and promises have not been kept, as usual. I think a lot of what Boris Johnson, our current Prime Minister, has kind of promised us, and he was very promising. I remember I was so enthusiastic about it. Made this second mistake. Same with Trump, although on a quick aside on Trump, I think he fulfilled his. I never thought of him as a philosophical or a statesman prodigy. I mean, come on, let's be real, right? Let's be real here. That's not the way I saw him, as a challenge, as if, pardon my vulgarity, as a spit in the face to the establishment, as a spit in the face to the media, and it was really the golden age for me. I loved 2016 to 2020. I mean, it was a constant trolling and total disintegration of the media. I mean, it was such a turmoil, and obviously he made promises and he didn't deliver. But realistically speaking, we weren't supposed to be expecting that anyway. And what he has done is has kind of shaken things up a bit, which is exactly what I think we needed to awaken from this kind of neoliberal slumber that we found ourselves in. But it's a similar thing when Boris Johnson ran. I was excited. He was promising all these great things, and obviously he was at the forefront of Brexit, and perhaps Britain can regain its independence and so on. However, as I have already mentioned, promises have not been kept. And another question comes from Robin, and this is to you, Mr. Ramsey. Does Ramsey Paul think American cities are now a lost cause?
I would advise. I personally like to get out of the city. Cities tend to be a little bit more. It's an interesting thing. I don't even think this is necessarily just America. I know, like in Hungary, Budapest is a lot more left wing than the rest of Budapest. There's something about a city versus a country. It's a different mindset. I prefer the country now. My home is in the country. I'm right now in the city of Fayetteville, but it's not a large city. Lost cause, I don't know. It depends on the specific city. There's areas that the cities are still fine. Other areas, obviously, is spun out of control. But for now, as we're going through a difficult period, I would definitely avoid certain areas that you'd find in certain cities. Definitely, it could get pretty bad. So I don't know. Lost cause is always kind of a hard thing because you have to put a timeline on it and everything else. I think we go through cyclical things, and eventually cities will come back. But right now, as things break down economically, and have a lot more crime now because they're not prosecuting people. Yeah, there's certain cities now like San Francisco, Chicago that are lost causes, and you probably should get out of there if you can while you still can. It could be very dangerous if things start to break apart. So.
Yeah, I kind of my background is I've grown up in the city, in the capital of Lithuania, the Baltic state. I grew up in, and but however, my weekends and most of my free time I spent in our countryside home, and this
Mhm.
is I have a special attachment for the countryside, and this is
Yeah.
connecting back to the nostalgia that we were talking about. For me, man, I still remember to this day. I was a little kid with my cousin, and run. We would run to our neighbor who's this old lady, and she would give us milk in these very simple jars, and we would buy milk from her, straight from her little farm, and she would allow us to look at her chickens and rabbits and so on. I think there is something so great, so simple, so romantic about that life that isn't just full of concrete and stone and kind of miserable faces and crowds and crowds of people. I really do believe there is something special about just going outside on kind of a a plain, a field, a cornfield perhaps, and seeing all the sheep in the distance and the church spire. It's really something special. And in that sense, I think British countryside, English countryside, is so fantastic. I absolutely adore it. When I travel by train in the United Kingdom, I'm just glued to not to the screen of my phone, but to actually looking outside. It's very picturesque, and the hills are are nice and kind of idyllic.
Yeah,
But
I think there's almost a component or a genetic component. I think our people. I'm from the British Isles, and I like that kind of weather when it's a little bit cooler, and I like the forest. And I think a lot of our people have an affinity towards that, and we see that in the United States because, like the black population, they really don't like the forest or the mountains, and they have troubles because they're always pushing, trying to get them in there. They're very uncomfortable in that environment, and I think there could be a genetic component to that. That's not their natural habitat that they're used to, and I do think there's something to that, that we long for something deep within our history, and it resonates within us, and I definitely feel that too.
yeah, so I'd like to ask you for advice. I'm still young, and though I can tell you, even though from my position, I'm young. It feels like I'm getting old. It feels like the number 30 is such a terror for us, for young people especially, and it's the same for every one of my friends that I talk to. We dread that number 30. I don't know. We just think there's something inside us. Obviously, we know rationally that it's not the case, but something inside us that tells us that this is almost kind of the end of our glory days and so on and so forth. Although you can certainly make an argument, and rationally speaking, I think the man comes fully into himself and achieves his highest potential really in his probably late 30s or 40s, when he's achieved something in life, when he has status, when he has money, when he has family. That is kind of the golden sweet spot, but we tremble before that number 30 for some reason. And in that sense, I wanted to ask you, how would you go about, and just in general, obviously, in terms of legal matters that could be different across different territories, but how would you suggest that people raise children these days? This is something that I'm getting to the point where, well, my mom had me when she was 21, so I'm really late at this point to the party. So I'm really I wish for a family. And so what I would like to ask is how would one shield their children from the horrors, the excesses of today?
Yeah, and obviously you're kind of in a better position, I think, because you're a man. You can have children. You don't have so much the deadline that women do.
Mm,
That they are definitely on the clock, so that's an advantage you have. And I think, in a way, it's kind of interesting because I've lived through it. Women, in a sense, they're kind of when they're young, they have, I think, things a little bit easier for them because they're pretty. Everyone, they get a lot of attention, and men don't so much get that when they're young, but when men get older it actually improves for them, and it gets harder for women. So it's one of those kind of funny things about life, how that kind of flip flops. But for children, I think what I would do is I would definitely in the United States not put them in a public school because the
hmm
public school really hates who they are, the race and everything. I would homeschool. I would try to keep. We talked about technology. I would
Mm-hmm.
definitely limit their technology exposure, and I would have them focus on real life toys, not just on the screen. The screen they can always pick up, the computers they can always pick up, but have
Mm-hmm.
the children really focus on the real world, so to speak. And I think that's an important part of it. And to be with a community where they share the same values of other people. So I think it's important to put that all into building a family. And I think a family should be, it's not always the case, can be possible, but should be a mother and a father. And
Mm-hmm.
it should be in a stable environment. Ideally, maybe grandparents involved. I think those things are very healthy for a child. And how many children people want, I think that's a personal matter. I don't try to I think sometimes in our sphere, there's too much pressure of, trying to get women to have more babies. And a lot of times maybe they can't, or they're having issues, or they choose not to. And I think we need to be respectful of that and not try to, you know, uh, that's just common courtesy. You shouldn't get involved with stuff like that. But most people, if they see a good future, they want children, and we need to encourage that. And if a couple can't, I mean, that's their business. Don't pry. But I definitely would. Homeschool is a big one. I
Mm-hmm.
would give the kid a religious background so they have that sort of a framework, give them a sense of purpose, and all those type of things that you can do. Uh, that's kind of how I guess I would do it starting over. I have two kids, and they did go to some Christian schools initially. Then they went to
Mm-hmm.
public schools. I think they turned out pretty good, but I'm a little biased. But that'd be my advice with children.
Mm. Did you, when you were young, dread kind of growing older? Did you dread the number 30 or whatever, or 25, or did you ever feel like your youth is escaping you at certain points?
No, the only time that really bothered me, I think, was 50. When I turned 50, that kind of bugged me. But beforehand, it never really bothered me because I was so busy in my career and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, especially as a man, it's not like when you hit 30, somehow that
Yeah.
lowers value. And I would say, actually, as you get older as a man, assuming you progress in life with status and so forth, your sexual market value, if you want to call it that, actually increases. So
Yes.
as a man, I wouldn't worry too much about that. What you need to really do is focus on your mission in life. And I tell guys this all the time. I don't care your age. Your focus shouldn't be just on, oh, I need to get a girl, I need to get married. It should be
Mm.
focused on whatever God's mission has given to you. I think we'll all have a mission. And I think if you're successful, you'll attract women sort of like a light attracts
Mm.
moths, right? I think that really will happen. Whereas if you're running around trying to chase girls, it usually has the opposite effect. You kind of come across as desperate, and it just doesn't work that way. You just got to be real, I think, centered in yourself first. And I think it will come. I know it's a tough situation for young guys. Hey, I've been there, but I understand. I think you need to put your priorities first. If you have your priorities in life, I think God will bring you what you need. And if you just have to have really that attitude, and I think that gives you a sense of peace about it.
Mm. Yeah, I think a lot of the insecurities that men have right now in modern society are due to the feminization of society, where spaces have become that were usually occupied exclusively by men and were created for men are now kind of being challenged by women. Women are being introduced into these spaces, and as you would know, of course, introducing, let's say, a female into a male company, it it's not a good omen. It's going to create conflicts, unnecessary conflicts between the men and so on. There's just this sexual tension that starts to arise. But what I really wanted to get at is, do you think that in this feminization of society, perhaps fatherlessness is to blame? You know, there are so many. I mean, there are so many. There are so many friends of mine who have these insecurities that coincidentally also were brought up by only their mothers. And so, by only their mother. So, perhaps, do you think that perhaps this feminization of society is due to this kind of widespread fatherlessness? And do you think that this kind of liberalization of divorce has negatively impacted us in that way?
Well, yeah, definitely. And I would say if you have to choose between being raised by a mother only or a father only, it's better to have a father for both sexes. I'm 100% believe that from experience of people I've known. People that have been raised just by the father do much better than people are just raised by the mother. I think ideally, though, you should have both.
Mm,
And you talk about divorce, but it's even more than divorce. At least in the United States, there's a lot of illegitimacy that's just become kind
mm,
of norm. And I do think that is a mistake. And I think if you are going to have unprotected sex, you have a responsibility to the child because
mm,
sex isn't all about entertainment. When you do it in that fashion, you could bring a life in the world, and you have a responsibility. And you have a responsibility. I think the child has the right to have a mother and a father and have a stable environment. So, yeah, the whole feminization thing, I wouldn't get too hung up on. Part of it's
mhm.
because men have allowed it,
Oh yeah, for
and
sure.
if you just kind of cut that out of your life, you won't have so much of an issues with it.
Mm.
Uh, but yeah, definitely, I think fathers are extremely important.
Do you think in the cases of divorce and let's say illegitimacy and adultery and all these cases, do you think the government has a good government, a just government, should have some role to play in it? So perhaps uh, punitive measures for things like adultery and illegitimacy and so on and so forth, and or perhaps the opposite, encouragement, social, financial encouragement of good, stable families? Or do you think that that is beyond the scope of a government?
No, I think it's the point of the government is to help support healthy family formations. And I would like my theoretical society. I think if you're married and you have children under the age of 18, I don't think you should be able to get divorced. I mean, if you have to live separate, that's
Hmm.
fine. I would pretty much not allow divorce. Now, once the kids are older, maybe you can get a divorce, or if you don't have children, maybe you can get a divorce. But even in those situations, I would like probably have a limit. You can get divorced at max 3 times in your life, and after that, you can't get married anymore. You're no longer legally allowed to be married. So I think there's things that the government can do to help family formation. I'm not a big fan of illegitimacy. I would give you basically one try, and then after that, I would do forced sterilization. I really would, because it's
Wow.
dangerous how it happens when you allow people like that to um, not being in a stable home environment is so destructive, and you're putting the whole society at risk. So I would definitely place restrictions on having children outside of marriage.
Mm. Yeah, so if you don't mind, we'll go on for just a couple more minutes so that we round out the 2 hours. That it's been 2 hours already, almost, which is quite amazing. I didn't notice it passing at all. But you mentioned sterilization, and that
Uh-huh.
reminded me, for some reason, capital punishment. What is your view on that? What is your view on the government dispensing kind of or killing someone for what it believes to be a just cause?
Yeah, I think is entirely appropriate. In my fantasy society, I'm not a big fan of long-term prison sentences.
Hmm.
I think the punishment should either be, you pay restitution, or maybe a prison sentence, a max of 5 years, or capital punishment. And I think you should first be tried by a jury to figure if you're innocent or guilty. And if you're guilty, they should look at what's the appropriate punishment. And if you're a career criminal that's constantly doing violent acts, I don't think we as a society should have to put up with you, put up with your antics in prison, I mean, you should just be gone. And so I don't have a problem with capital punishment. Now, I would have appeals and so forth like that, but yeah, I have no problem with capital punishment. And it's funny because someone will say, "Oh, but you're against abortion. How can you reconcile the two?" Well, one is a guilty person, and the other is an innocent life.
Mhm.
That's how I see the difference between the two.
Yeah, exactly. There is just killing, for example,
Yes,
in times of war, like Saint Augustine talks about just war theory,
right,
and
exactly.
also and some states or some societies deem some crimes to be so terrible, so soul destroying that they do not think that they do think that you are supposed to pay your life back, but the difference, of course, with abortion is that it's murder. Abortion is murder by definition because it is an innocent human life that you are terminating. So
Right.
that's a difference that shouldn't trip up any conservative there. But do you think that with appeals and courts and so on, do you think society has become too legalistic? American society has become too legalistic. And I remember you mentioning you were talking about the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. Would you like to see perhaps in your ideal society, would you like to see less kind of arguing over commas in a constitution and more kind of following the spirit or the natural development of law as it as it would happen across time? What is your view on this legalistic outlook that we seem to have adopted?
Yeah, I think the legalistic outlook is not good. It leads to injustice. And again, ideally, I'd have a society, let's say the courtroom decision. If you're convicted of armed robbery, what should be your punishment? There should be a separate phase for that, and it should be for the jury to look at mitigating factors. Have you done this many times in the past? Have you committed violent crimes? And if so, how many times? I think you need to look at the whole entire situation to determine the proper punishment for a crime and not just be put into a box. Because again, you have the spirit of the law. That's really the idea, and you don't want to get into this legalistic aspect of it, which I think is, uh, you saw even in, I think Shakespeare talked about that with Shylock or whatever, about, how you
Hmm.
figure out all these things. The idea is you need to have grace, and you want to give people chances, but at the same time, you don't want them to abuse it. So you don't want them, a guilty person to get free because they're doing some weird loophole. But at the same time, you don't want to damn someone to an unjust punishment because, wow, this is what the statute says. I think you need a lot of leeway and use, I guess, common sense, which is, I think, you get a more just outcome.
In terms of reforming prisoners and the prison system in general, Edward Dutton, whom we already talked about, the
Right.
YouTuber, he's a very scientifically minded, of course, as he is a professor, but he talks about IQ levels and so on, and how prisons work. They keep people who are dangerous, and they would be predicted to be dangerous on an almost genetic level. So, where criminality as a trait kind of passes throughout generations. So you can actually inherit criminality. You can, as you would inherit, as it kind of is a convergence of a lot of character traits like psychopathy and all that stuff. But my kind of point um, is the prison system, is it meant to be more punitive or is it meant to be reforming? What is your outlook?
In my society, be more reforming. I want to have someone in prison more than 5 years, and if they should be in more than 5 years, I would just have them executed. We don't have to tolerate violent people that can't get with the program. Some people that really, the people that commit the kind crimes in this country is just a very small percent that do it over and over and over. And when I went to court on a jury, I sat on a jury. I saw some criminals, and I talked to this one guy, lawyer, and he goes, "Yeah, we see the same people all the time, every day." And so it's just, there's certain people that if they can't get their act together, they should just be gone. Get rid of them. I'm fine with execution and that, but I do understand that we do need sometimes prison, and I don't think a prison should be a torturous place. I think it should be
Hmm.
humane. I think it should have a goal of trying to get people on the right track. That's how I look at it. I think our prison system now just is a school for criminals. I think we need to get away from that. That'd be my point of view. So I'm kind of a mix, right? I'm kind of a bleeding heart that way for the prisoners. I don't like to see a cruel system, but people that can't get with the program and continue to do violent crimes and prey on people over and over, I'm like, why in the hell are you sharing air with
Yeah.
us? You need to get going. So I'm kind of hardcore that way. So I'm kind of a mix.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Well, I don't want to end on execution and imprisonment and criminality. So I just wanted to ask you something that
Yeah.
something useful and kind of perhaps on a lighter note. Or books. So but perhaps what is the last book that you have read or now that you're currently reading, and what would you say is the most influential book on your if there are any, of course, if you're a big book reader, as I would guess you are. What is the kind of most influential book that shaped your outlook on life?
I guess I don't know. Most influential. I tend to go back to War and Peace a lot.
Mm.
That sounds pretentious. I know. I hate to say that, but I really think Tolstoy had a view of humanity that was really quite
Mm.
interesting. And I'm currently reading James Joyce's Ulysses, which is a pain in the ass. It's considered one of the more difficult books in English, but I want to get through it to try to see. I mean, he's a brilliant man, or he was a brilliant man, but
Mhm.
I don't really care for how he writes and stuff. He writes to be difficult, just to be difficult, and his whole book seems to be, look how clever I am. I'm making all these, symbolism and all this, and I'm like, yeah, I kind of get it, but it's annoying. So he was a brilliant man, but I so far not caring for it. But I am going through Ulysses, and that sounds pretentious too, because that's considered one of the most difficult books in English language. But um, I don't mean to come across pretentious because I'm really not that way. But that's what I'm doing. Right. You asked a question, so I'll
Yes.
keep it in.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Oh, thanks so much for this. This has been so much fun. I think you
It's been good.
always.
You're really good, and I encourage people to subscribe to you and watch you. You're a very good interviewer, and you're really thoughtful. And I really want to see more people like you to take the leap like this, because we need some of these more in-depth discussions that are interesting, and we talk about topics. And I think it's something I enjoy. And so if you're doing something that you would enjoy listening to, I think that's a good sign.
Yeah, for sure. And my kind of what I like is exploring the individual as well, not just the issues. I do find that I don't just find the ideas that you, for example, put across, Mr. Ramsey, is interesting. I find you as a person interesting, and I would hopefully find anyone whom I talk to be interesting. And I kind of want to explore the background of that person, hence some of the personal questions about nostalgia and how you spend your time. I think this is really important when you have a political or when you have a political, let's say, a political person, someone who's active in politics or who's some kind of in some kind of a leadership role, which I think you're seen as a. You've been around the conservative bloc, as I understand it, and you've kind of been been behind a lot of these conservative, what are now huge conservative alternative figures like Nick Fuentes and the like. And so I kind of wanted to get more into who you are as a man, which I think is very important when you're talking to someone. Well, thank you very much for coming. It's a real honor. I don't think I could have asked for any better first guest than Paul Ramsey himself on my very first stream. So hopefully at some point in the future we'll do more of these if you're up for it. This has been great.
Definitely.
I'll definitely start posting some content. I'll figure out the schedule and the themes. And if you guys have any suggestions for how we can improve the stream and the experience, what kind of content you'd like to see, and so on, please leave them in the comments. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the evening, everybody. And thank you very much, Mr. Paul Ramsey, for coming.
Thank you. And if you're ever in Arkansas, come see me, and we'll do something non-pretentious. We'll drink some beer and shoot some guns or something. So
That sounds excellent. I haven't been to the United States yet, and I'm planning to, so that's definitely going to be my first stop.
we'll open invitation.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that.
All right.
All right.
Thank you,
See you
guys. Bye
guys.
bye.